Today, we're diving into a fascinating battle that was fought not with swords and guns, but with ink and paper. This is the story of how India's press went head-to-head with the British Raj, becoming an absolutely crucial weapon in the fight for freedom.
So, here's our game plan. We're going to start by setting the stage, the press as a colonial battlefield. Then we'll look at the first British laws, the infamous Gagging Act, and the incredible rise of nationalist journalism that fought back. We'll wrap up by looking at the final controls and the lasting legacy of this whole struggle.
All right, first up, the press as a colonial battlefield. Now, it's so important to get this. During this time, newspapers were way more than just a source of information. They were really the main arena where the intellectual and political war for India's future was being fought.
And that brings us to the one question that just absolutely terrified the British administration. Think about it. Could a simple newspaper, just a bunch of printed pages, actually pose a threat to the most powerful empire in the world? Well, in their minds, the answer was a definite, resounding yes.
Yeah, from the British point of view, a free press was an incredibly dangerous thing. It was a tool that could spread these radical ideas of nationalism and political consciousness, what they called sedition, basically anything that might stir up discontent against the government. They figured if you could control the press, you could control the story, and that meant you could control the people.
So this deep-seated fear leads us right into our next section, the very first attempts by the British to put a clamp on free speech. Let's take a look at these early regulations because they really set the stage for the century-long fight that was about to unfold. What's really fascinating about this period is the constant push and pull. It's like a seesaw. In 1799, you have Wellesley bringing in pre-censorship. By 1823, you need a government license just to have a printing press. But then you get this amazing, brief moment of freedom with Metcalfe in 1835, only for the 1857 revolt to scare the government into slamming the door shut all over again with a new licensing act.
And this right here perfectly shows the two competing mindsets inside the British administration. On one hand, you had guys like Lord Bentinck, who saw the press as this ticking time bomb of sedition that had to be kept under lock and key. But then you had Charles Metcalfe, who believed a free press was essential for progress. His 1835 act was a huge deal. It earned him the nickname Liberator of the Indian Press, and, you guessed it, led to a boom in new newspapers.
But that period of freedom, well, it wasn't going to last. And that brings us to what is probably the most notorious piece of press law from that era, Lord Lytton's Vernacular Press Act, better known by its nickname, the Gagging Act.
Okay, so this is the crucial point to understand. The Vernacular Press Act of 1878 was designed to be discriminatory. Vernacular just means the local, native language of a place. So this law wasn't about controlling all newspapers, no. It was a surgical strike aimed squarely at the Indian language press, which was growing fast and becoming very critical of British rule. Meanwhile, the English language papers largely left alone.
And the way this act worked was just brutally effective. A district magistrate could force a publisher to put down a bond, basically a security deposit, to guarantee good behavior. If that paper published anything the government didn't like, they could seize the printing press and all the equipment. And here's the kicker. There was no appeal. What the magistrate said went. Game over.
But this kind of oppression often sparks incredible acts of clever resistance. The most famous story, hands down, is about the Amrit Bazar Patrika. To get around this act, which, remember, only applied to vernacular papers, the publishers did something amazing. They converted it from a Bengali English paper into a fully English weekly, literally overnight. Just a brilliant move.
And that story is the perfect segue into our next section. Because all this repression, it didn't silence the Indian voice. If anything, it made it louder. This period saw an explosion in nationalist journalism as leaders and reformers picked up the newspaper as their #1 weapon. So let's quickly meet some of these pioneers. It all started way back in 1780 with James Hickey's Bengal Gazette. But the real nationalist spirit in journalism started to fire up with people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. His paper, Sambad Kaumudi, was a powerful voice for social reform, famously campaigning against the horrific practice of sati. And then you have Dadabhai Nauroji's Rast Gofratar, which pushed for social change in the Parsi community.
And as the freedom struggle really gained momentum, the newspapers became even more influential. The Hindu was born as a powerful voice of protest. Lokmanya Tilak's Kesari, published in Marathi, was absolutely essential in spreading the message of Swaraj, self-rule, and Swadeshi, promoting Indian goods. And this wasn't just talk. Tilak would use its pages to tear apart British economic policies, urging people to boycott foreign products.
And then you had papers like Yugontar, which took things even further, openly calling for revolution.
Okay, so as we move into the 20th century, the nationalist movement is getting bigger, more organized, and more widespread. And you can probably guess what happened next. The British administration hit back with a whole new wave of even tougher laws. You can see a very clear pattern emerging here, right? It's a cycle of action and reaction. The extremist writings of the early 1900s? That leads to the 1908 Act. The political unrest during World War I? That's met with the Defense of India Act. The massive civil disobedience movement in the 1930s? The government counters with the Press Act of 1931. A constant cat-and-mouse game.
But it's important to know that the fight for free press did score some real victories. After World War I, a committee led by Tez Bahadur Sapru actually succeeded in getting the harsh acts of 1908 and 1910 repealed. It might have been temporary, but it was a huge moment of relief, and it proved that organized resistance could actually make a difference. So after this century-long battle, what's the lasting impact? Let's jump to our final section and really unpack the legacy of this struggle, which transformed the press from just a tool of liberation into what we now call the Fourth Estate. All right, so if there's anything you take away from this entire explainer, let it be these key points. British policy was always a reaction, always playing catch-up to Indian nationalism. The Vernacular Press Act was a masterclass in discriminatory lawmaking. Indian nationalists were brilliant at turning the press into their main weapon for mobilizing the masses. And ultimately, you can't separate the two. The fight for a free press was the fight for a free India. And all of this history is what laid the groundwork for the role of the press in modern India today.
And that leaves us with one final and, I think, really important question to think about. This whole story shows us the incredible price that was paid for the freedom to speak, to write, and to criticize power. So, after a 100-year-long battle to win that right, the question for all of us now is, what is the fundamental duty of the press in a free nation today? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.